Case 1. Jennifer Hall. In a 50-bed hospital in Chillicothe, Missouri, a facility called Hedrick Medical Center recorded 18 cardiac emergency events in a 5-month span. In the years before that period, the hospital had averaged roughly one such event annually. 9 patients died during those events. Investigators would later describe them in court filings as medically suspicious. Jennifer Hall worked at Hedrick Medical Center as a respiratory therapist. She was not a licensed nurse, but her role placed her at the center of patient care during respiratory and cardiac emergencies, and her case became one of the most closely watched hospital death investigations in Missouri history. The timeline begins in December of 2001 and extends into May of 2002. During this window, the hospital's cardiac arrest rate rose sharply above its historical baseline. A rise like this, inside a single facility, over a matter of months, is the kind of statistical anomaly that hospital administrators and later investigators are trained to notice. When emergency event rates spike without an external explanation, such as a seasonal illness outbreak or a change in patient population, administrators are required to review staffing patterns, medication access logs, and individual case files. Autopsy and toxicology analysis on 2 of the patients who died found the presence of succinylcholine, a paralytic agent, and morphine, a controlled opioid. Neither medication had been prescribed to these patients for the circumstances in which it was found. The presence of an unprescribed paralytic in a person's system is considered strong physical evidence in a suspicious death investigation, because succinylcholine is not a substance a body produces or is exposed to through any accidental or environmental means. It is a hospital-controlled drug, and its presence signals direct human administration. Investigators then conducted what is known as a proximity and access analysis. This method examines which staff members were present, on shift, and had access to the relevant medications at the time each incident occurred. In the Hedrick Medical Center cases, Jennifer Hall was reported as being present for the events and responsible for reporting the emergencies as they happened. A civil wrongful death process began years after the deaths, when 5 affected families filed suit. That civil litigation ultimately did not proceed to resolution on the merits. The Missouri Supreme Court dismissed the civil claims on statute of limitations grounds in 2019, meaning the court found the families had filed outside the legally permitted window for civil action, not that the underlying facts were disputed. The turning point in the criminal side of the investigation came through advances in forensic toxicology. In 2017, tissue samples preserved from the original investigation were retested using improved detection methods for succinylcholine. This retesting produced findings that supported reopening the criminal case. Jennifer Hall was charged with first-degree murder in May of 2022 in connection with the death of 1 patient and with an additional count later that year connected to a second patient death. She also faced a charge related to an attempted assault on a 3rd patient who survived. In April of 2023, Hall entered a guilty plea. The charges were resolved through a plea agreement to reduced counts, first-degree involuntary manslaughter for each of the 2 patient deaths, and second-degree assault for the surviving patient. A guilty plea to involuntary manslaughter, rather than murder, reflects a legal determination, reached through negotiation between prosecution and defense, about the level of intent and culpability that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. Sentencing took place on August 18, 2023. Jennifer Hall received 18 years, 7 years for each of the 2 manslaughter counts and 4 years for the assault count, to be served consecutively. The sentence carries the possibility of parole. The Livingston County prosecuting attorney, Adam Warren, addressed the court and the public afterward, noting that the resolution came after 2 decades of investigation and litigation. This case illustrates several investigation principles used across hospital death inquiries nationally. The use of statistical baseline comparison to flag anomalous mortality clusters, the reliance on toxicology to identify medications inconsistent with a patient's treatment plan, and the use of proximity and access logs to narrow the pool of possible responsible parties. It also illustrates the long timeline such cases often require, from initial suspicion, through failed civil litigation, to renewed forensic testing, to eventual criminal resolution. There is one detail in the public record on this case that has not been fully reconciled and deserves an honest note. Two separate news organizations identified the second victim in this case differently, one reporting the individual as a man in his 30s, the other as a man in his 80s. Both organizations are credible outlets, and the discrepancy likely reflects a reporting error on one side rather than any dispute about the underlying facts of the plea. Responsible documentation of a case requires acknowledging when a detail like this remains unresolved in the public record, rather than silently choosing one version. Jennifer Hall's case stands, at the time of this recording, as the most fully adjudicated example in Missouri of a hospital worker convicted in connection with multiple patient deaths. It took investigators nearly 20 years, and it took a scientific advancement in toxicology testing to bring the case to a resolution the courts could stand behind. That is Case 1. Case 2, Richard Williams. This case involves the largest suspected cluster of suspicious patient deaths ever investigated at a Missouri medical facility, and it ended not in conviction, but in the dismissal of every charge. We include it here because it is one of the most extensively documented nurse-related investigations in the state's history, and because understanding why it collapsed is as instructive as understanding a conviction. Richard Allen Williams worked as a registered nurse at the Harry S. Truman Memorial Veterans Hospital in Columbia, Missouri. In 1992, the ward where he worked, identified in records as Ward 4E, experienced a year in which 41 patients died, a total that led hospital administrators and later federal investigators to examine whether the deaths were all attributable to natural causes. Investigators conducted a statistical comparison of patient mortality against staff shift schedules. This analysis found that patients were roughly 20 times more likely to die during shifts when Williams was working, compared to shifts covered by 11 other nurses on the same ward. Of the 10 deaths that would eventually form the basis of criminal charges, Williams was reportedly the only staff member on duty during each one. The alleged method centered on succinylcholine, the same paralytic substance identified in Case 1. The challenge for investigators was that, at the time, forensic science did not have a fully reliable method for detecting succinylcholine in tissue that had been preserved for an extended period after death. In 1993, the Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General's Office authorized the exhumation of several of the deceased patients so that tissue samples could be examined. A laboratory scientist, working through National Medical Services Laboratories, developed and applied a new tissue testing method. That testing reportedly identified succinylcholine in 10 of the exhumed bodies. This finding formed the central forensic basis for the criminal case that followed. The investigation itself was extensive. It involved the Veterans Affairs Inspector General's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and prosecutors eventually built a case file that included interviews with more than 100 witnesses. Richard Williams was arrested and formally charged in July of 2002 with 10 counts of first-degree murder. Given the scale of the allegations, prosecutors indicated they would pursue the death penalty. Williams pleaded not guilty to all counts and maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. What followed over the next year was a forensic re-examination that ultimately undid the case. As the defense and independent reviewers scrutinized the tissue testing methodology that had identified succinylcholine in the exhumed remains, significant doubts emerged about its reliability. The Federal Bureau of Investigation attempted to replicate the original test results and could not do so. Faced with this, the scientist who had developed the original test formally withdrew his conclusions. Without a reliable forensic finding to support the presence of the alleged murder weapon in the victim's remains, the prosecution's case could no longer meet the evidentiary standard required for a murder trial. On August 6, 2003, Boone County prosecutor Kevin Crane dismissed all 10 counts. In his public statement, Crane said that adequate evidence to show the deceased veterans had not died of natural causes was, once again, absent from the case, language that directly referenced the same evidentiary gap that had existed a decade earlier, before the tissue test had appeared to close it. Defense counsel Don Catlett characterized the forensic method that had driven the original charges as unreliable science that should never have formed the basis of a capital murder case. Williams was released from custody, and the murder case against him has not been refiled. He has consistently maintained his innocence. The case remains, in the formal legal sense, unresolved. Not a conviction, not an acquittal, but a dismissal grounded in the collapse of the forensic evidence that had been used to bring the charges in the first place. This case is a documented lesson in forensic reliability, a test that appears, at first application, to solve a series of unexplained deaths must be independently replicated before it can support a conviction, and in a capital case, replication failure is not a technicality. It is the difference between a courtroom and continued suspicion without resolution. The case was revisited in a 2024 true crime podcast, which examined both the original 1992 mortality data and the forensic collapse that ended the prosecution. We present this case with full transparency about its outcome. Richard Williams was charged, not convicted. The distinction matters, and any account of Missouri hospital death investigations that omits it is incomplete. That is Case 2. Case 3. Lindsay Francis. This case centers on the diversion of a controlled substance from a hospital emergency department, and it demonstrates how a single discarded item, found by a coworker, can trigger a federal investigation. Lindsay Francis worked as a registered nurse at St. Francis Medical Center in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. According to court records, beginning around June or July of 2021, Francis began diverting leftover fentanyl, an opioid used for pain management in clinical settings, for personal use. Court documents cite work-related stress and personal stress as contributing factors described during the case's resolution. The total quantity diverted was determined to be under 4 grams. The discovery process began on January 15, 2022, when a coworker found a used syringe in an emergency room locker room. This kind of discovery, an item found outside its expected clinical context, is one of the most common ways diversion cases come to light in hospital settings, because used medical supplies are subject to strict disposal protocols, and any deviation from those protocols draws immediate scrutiny from staff trained to notice them. Following the discovery, hospital administrators and internal investigators examined medication records and identified a fentanyl vial that had been tampered with, meaning its contents did not match what dispensing records indicated should remain. This kind of vial discrepancy is typically identified through a combination of physical inspection, weight or volume verification, and cross-referencing against the automated dispensing system's records. The hospital confronted Francis with these findings, and the matter was referred to federal authorities. The Drug Enforcement Administration opened an investigation, which is standard procedure when a controlled substance has been diverted from a healthcare facility, since fentanyl and similar medications are regulated under federal drug scheduling law, regardless of the jurisdiction in which the diversion occurs. Francis pleaded guilty in May of 2023 to 1 count of unlawfully acquiring a controlled substance. This charge reflects the federal government's framework for prosecuting diversion. It is not a charge related to patient harm, but to the unlawful acquisition of a regulated substance by a person authorized to handle it only for legitimate clinical purposes. Sentencing occurred in August of 2023. United States District Judge Stephen N. Limbaugh, Jr. sentenced Francis to 3 years of probation, 200 hours of public service, a fine of $5,000, and mandatory participation in a drug treatment program. This sentencing structure, probation combined with treatment rather than incarceration, is common in federal diversion cases where the defendant is a first-time offender, where the diverted substance was intended for personal use rather than resale, and where the court determines that treatment addresses the underlying cause of the offense more effectively than a custodial sentence. It's worth explaining, for context, why cases like this one are prosecuted federally rather than at the state level. Controlled substances, such as fentanyl, are regulated under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, and the Drug Enforcement Administration has jurisdiction to investigate diversion regardless of which state it occurs in. When a healthcare worker diverts a federally scheduled drug from a hospital, the case is typically routed to the United States Attorney's Office for the relevant federal district, in this instance, the Eastern District of Missouri. This case also demonstrates the layered safeguard system hospitals rely on to catch diversion. Physical disposal protocols that make discarded items conspicuous when out of place, automated dispensing systems that track every withdrawal against a specific patient and provider, and a professional culture in which staff are trained to report irregularities rather than overlook them. It was the combination of a co-worker's observation and a vial-level records check that brought this case to light, not a proactive audit initiated by hospital leadership. Lindsay Francis's case remains one of the clearer examples of individual diversion prosecuted to a defined federal outcome in Missouri, without any allegation of patient harm beyond the diversion itself. That is Case 3. Case 4. Jessica Powell. This case involves a nurse who used a hospital's own record-keeping system against itself, entering false and real patient names to withdraw controlled substances she was not authorized to take for personal use. Jessica Marie Powell was a registered nurse employed by DaVita, a healthcare company that operates dialysis units within hospital systems, and she worked in that capacity at DePaul Hospital in Bridgeton, Missouri, as well as at SSM Health Lake St. Louis. According to federal court records, between February 13, 2017 and February 14, 2018, a period of exactly 1 year, Powell diverted hydromorphone and a combination medication containing oxycodone and acetaminophen. The method used was documented through the hospital's Pyxis system, an automated medication dispensing cabinet used widely across American hospitals to control and log access to scheduled drugs. Every withdrawal from a Pyxis machine is tied to a specific user login, a specific patient record, and a timestamp. According to the investigation, Powell entered both fictitious patient names and the names of real patients who had not been prescribed the medications in question in order to justify withdrawals that were, in fact, for her own use. She then falsified the accompanying administration records to make the withdrawals appear legitimate on paper. This type of diversion, using a legitimate dispensing system's own audit trail to disguise theft, requires a different detection method than the discarded syringe discovery seen in Case 3. Here, detection depends on periodic reconciliation audits, in which hospital pharmacy staff or compliance officers cross-reference every withdrawal against the corresponding patient's actual physician orders and administration charting. When a withdrawal does not correspond to a valid prescription, or when a patient's name appears in the withdrawal log without a matching clinical order, it generates a discrepancy that compliance teams are required to investigate. The investigation into Powell's conduct was carried out by the Drug Enforcement Administration, which, as in the previous case, holds jurisdiction over the diversion of federally scheduled substances regardless of the state in which the offense occurs. Powell was indicted on October 10, 2019, in the Eastern District of Missouri. She was one of 4 healthcare professionals named in indictments handed down that same day, a detail that reflects a broader federal enforcement effort targeting diversion across multiple St. Louis area hospital systems rather than an isolated single-case investigation. She pleaded guilty to obtaining a controlled substance by fraud, a federal charge that specifically addresses the falsification element of her conduct, the use of deception rather than simple unauthorized possession to obtain the drugs. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation. This case is a useful example of how modern hospital medication systems generate their own evidence trail. Every dispensing cabinet interaction creates a permanent digital record: who accessed the cabinet, what was withdrawn, for which patient, and at what time. That same system, designed to protect patients and maintain accountability, becomes the primary evidentiary foundation when someone attempts to misuse it. Investigators did not need to rely on witness testimony or physical evidence discovery to build this case. They relied on the digital audit trail the hospital's own compliance infrastructure had already created. It also illustrates a broader enforcement pattern. Federal prosecutors in Missouri have, on more than one occasion, pursued coordinated indictments against several healthcare workers from the same hospital system when an internal audit uncovers a pattern of diversion extending across multiple staff members. Jessica Powell's case was one component of that broader enforcement action. The outcome, probation without incarceration, reflects federal sentencing practice for diversion offenses involving personal use rather than distribution to others, particularly where there was no allegation that a patient was denied necessary medication or suffered harm as a direct result of the diversion. That is Case 4. Case 5, Lindsay Maupin. This case is notable for one specific detail. The nurse involved had already been terminated from a previous position for the same conduct before being hired at the hospital where she would ultimately be caught a second time. Lindsay J. Maupin, a resident of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, worked as a registered nurse at Mercy Hospital South in St. Louis County. According to federal court records, between January the 18th and February the 2nd of 2020, Maupin fraudulently obtained fentanyl from the hospital's automated dispensing system for personal use. What distinguishes this case is the pattern that preceded it. Public reporting on the case notes that Maupin had previously been dismissed from another healthcare position after being caught engaging in the same type of diversion. This raises a documented challenge within the healthcare licensing and hiring system. State nursing boards and individual hospital human resources departments do not always share disciplinary information in real time, and a nurse terminated for diversion at one facility can, in some circumstances, be hired at another before disciplinary action is finalized or before that action becomes visible in standard background screening. The detection process at Mercy Hospital South began with a pharmacy-level review. Hospital pharmacy staff monitor aggregate withdrawal patterns across all authorized staff, and this kind of monitoring is designed specifically to catch anomalies like the one found in this case. Maupin's fentanyl withdrawals were found to be several times higher in volume than the withdrawals of her nursing peers performing comparable duties. A volume discrepancy of this magnitude, sustained over even a short period, is one of the most reliable indicators used in hospital compliance monitoring, because it does not depend on catching a single incident. It depends on statistical comparison across the whole staff population. Following the pharmacy flag, Maupin was required to undergo drug testing, and a positive result was returned on February the 4th, 2020. This positive test, combined with the withdrawal volume discrepancy, formed the basis for referral to the Drug Enforcement Administration, which opened a federal investigation. The matter was also referred to the Missouri Board of Nursing, the state licensing body responsible for reviewing whether a nurse's conduct violates professional standards and whether continued licensure is appropriate. It's worth explaining the relationship between these two parallel processes, because they often run at the same time, but serve different purposes. The Drug Enforcement Administration and federal prosecutors address the criminal dimension of diversion, whether a federal drug law was violated. The State Nursing Board addresses the licensing dimension, whether the nurse's professional credentials should be suspended, restricted, or revoked. A nurse can face criminal consequences, licensing consequences, or both, and the two processes do not automatically produce the same outcome or move on the same timeline. Maupin pleaded guilty in October of 2022 to one count of obtaining a controlled substance by fraud. On March the 9th, 2023, United States District Judge Stephen R. Clark sentenced her to 4 years of probation. This case underscores a systemic vulnerability that healthcare administrators and policy researchers have written about extensively: the gap between a termination for cause at one facility and the point at which that history becomes visible to a subsequent employer. Improvements to this system have included expanded reporting requirements to state nursing boards and greater reliance on national databases that track disciplinary actions across state lines, though implementation and consistency of use still vary between institutions. Maupin's 4-year probation term, longer than the sentences given in some of the other diversion cases in this documentary, may reflect the court's consideration of her documented history of prior termination for the same conduct, a factor commonly weighed at federal sentencing under aggravating circumstances guidelines. That is Case 5. Case 6, Alyssa Wedipole. This case remains one of the more procedurally significant entries in this documentary, not because of a dramatic resolution, but because its final outcome is not confirmed in the public record. And that gap is itself worth understanding. Alyssa Wedipole worked as a registered nurse at Mercy Hospital South, the same facility involved in Case 5. According to a federal indictment, Wedipole was alleged to have stolen a range of controlled substances, including hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, morphine, dronabinol, lorazepam, and tramadol, between October of 2018 and May of 2019, a period of roughly 7 months. The scope of substances named in this indictment is broader than in several of the other diversion cases in this documentary, spanning multiple drug classes rather than a single medication. Investigators identified the alleged diversion through an audit of the hospital's locked medication cabinets, cross-referenced against patient records and administration documentation. As in earlier cases, the investigation also examined whether records had been falsified to conceal the withdrawals, and the indictment alleges that falsified records were, in fact, part of the scheme. The Drug Enforcement Administration conducted the investigation, consistent with federal jurisdiction over controlled substance diversion. Wedipol was indicted on October 10, 2019, in the Eastern District of Missouri, the same date on which 3 other healthcare professionals, including Jessica Powell from Case 4, were indicted as part of a coordinated federal enforcement action addressing diversion across multiple St. Louis area hospital systems. The charge against Wedipol was receipt of controlled substance medications by deceit or fraud, carrying a maximum potential penalty of 4 years. What happened after the indictment, however, is where the public record becomes incomplete. No sentencing announcement, plea agreement, or trial outcome for Wedipol has been located in available news coverage or Department of Justice press releases. This does not necessarily mean the case is unresolved. Federal cases can conclude in several ways that do not always generate public press releases. A case may be resolved through a plea agreement that receives limited media coverage, particularly years after the initial indictment, when public attention has moved elsewhere. A case may be dismissed. Records in some circumstances may be sealed, particularly if a defendant later cooperates in a related investigation. Or a case may still be pending, moving slowly through pretrial proceedings. For a documentary built on verified fact, the responsible approach here is to state clearly what is known: the indictment, the alleged conduct, the time frame, and the charge, and to state equally clearly what is not known: the final disposition. Anyone seeking a definitive answer on this case's outcome would need to consult the federal court's electronic case filing system directly, searching the Eastern District of Missouri's records under Wedipol's name and the 2019 indictment. This case, alongside Case 7, illustrates an important distinction in how court-based documentaries should be built. An indictment is a formal accusation, supported by evidence a grand jury found sufficient to proceed, but it is not a finding of guilt. Until a plea or verdict is entered, a defendant remains legally presumed innocent, regardless of how detailed or serious the underlying allegations appear in charging documents. We include this case not because we can tell you how it ended, but because responsible investigative reporting sometimes means presenting an open thread honestly rather than manufacturing a resolution that does not exist in the verified record. That is Case 6. Case 7, Jacob Gautreaux. This case is presented alongside Case 6 because both originated from the same federal indictment and both share the same open question about final outcome. Jacob Gautreaux worked as a licensed paramedic, not a nurse, but a frontline emergency medical provider whose access to controlled substances in a hospital emergency department mirrors the access nurses have, and whose case was investigated using the same methods applied to nursing staff in this documentary. Gautreaux was assigned to the emergency department at SSM Health DePaul Hospital. According to the federal indictment, Gautreaux was alleged to have stolen fentanyl while working in that emergency department between May 1st and June 12th of 2019, a period of approximately 6 weeks. As in the other diversion cases in this documentary, the investigation relied on medication cabinet withdrawal records, cross-referenced against patient charts, to identify discrepancies between what was withdrawn and what was clinically documented as administered. Gautreaux was indicted on October 10, 2019, in the Eastern District of Missouri. Again, the same coordinated indictment date that produced charges against Jessica Powell and Alyssa Wedipol. This detail is worth pausing on. A single federal investigation, likely triggered by a broader compliance review across affiliated St. Louis hospital systems, resulted in charges against 4 separate healthcare workers on the same day. This pattern reflects how diversion investigations often begin with a systemic audit rather than a single reported incident. Pharmacy compliance teams or hospital system security departments review dispensing data across an entire network, identify multiple individuals with anomalous withdrawal patterns, and refer the group to federal investigators simultaneously. As with Case 6, the public record does not contain a documented final outcome for Gautreaux's case. No plea, sentencing, or dismissal announcement has been located in available reporting or federal press releases covering this matter. It is worth explaining, for viewers unfamiliar with federal criminal procedure, what typically happens between an indictment like this one and a final resolution. Following indictment, a defendant is arraigned and enters an initial plea, almost always not guilty, at this stage regardless of the eventual outcome. Pre-trial proceedings follow, during which the defense may file motions, negotiate with prosecutors, and review the evidence gathered by the Drug Enforcement Administration and federal prosecutors. The substantial majority of federal criminal cases in the United States are resolved through a negotiated guilty plea rather than a trial, often to a reduced charge relative to the original indictment. This is consistent with the outcomes documented in cases 3, 4, and 5 in this series, each of which involved a guilty plea to a fraud-related charge following an initial diversion allegation. Given that pattern, it is plausible that Gautreau's case, like Wedipol's, concluded through a plea agreement that did not generate significant independent news coverage, particularly since the case did not involve allegations of direct patient harm and would not have carried the same public interest as a homicide case. We present this case, as we did Case 6, with a clear acknowledgement of what remains unconfirmed. A responsible documentary does not fill an evidentiary gap with speculation dressed as fact. Where the public record stops, our account stops with it, and we direct anyone requiring certainty on the final outcome to the federal court's own case management system for the Eastern District of Missouri. That is Case 7. Case 8, Dennis Rowe. This case moves away from hospital drug diversion and into a different category entirely: abuse of a resident inside a long-term care facility, a category of offense investigated and prosecuted very differently from the pharmacy-based cases we've covered so far. Dennis A. Rowe worked as a nurse's aide, also known as a nursing assistant, at a nursing home in Carthage, Missouri. According to court testimony, Rowe physically abused a disabled resident under his care. Court records describe the conduct as striking the resident and forcing water into the resident's airway through medical oxygen tubing that had been prescribed for the resident's respiratory support. Because this case involves a vulnerable adult resident rather than a hospital medication system, the investigative and evidentiary process looked fundamentally different from the diversion cases in this documentary. There was no automated dispensing log to review, no toxicology report to run. Instead, the case relied on direct observation and testimony from facility staff, and on documented changes in the resident's condition and behavior correlating with Rowe's presence or absence on shift. Key testimony in the case came from the nursing home's administrator, who told the court that the resident's condition improved noticeably after Rowe was no longer working at the facility. Testimony of this kind, behavioral or physical improvement correlating with the removal of a specific caregiver, is a recognized form of circumstantial evidence in elder abuse prosecutions, particularly in cases involving residents who may have limited capacity to report abuse directly, whether due to cognitive impairment, communication barriers, or physical disability. Long-term care facility abuse cases in Missouri, as in most states, are typically investigated through a combination of internal facility reporting requirements, state health department inspections, and, when abuse is suspected, referral to local law enforcement and the state's Adult Protective Services Division. Missouri law classifies abuse of an elderly or disabled person receiving care as a distinct criminal offense, separate from general assault statutes, in recognition of the particular vulnerability of the population involved and the position of trust the caregiver occupies. Rowe's case proceeded to a jury trial in Jasper County Circuit Court in Joplin, Missouri, before Judge Gail Crane. The trial itself was completed within a single day, a relatively compact timeline compared to the multi-year processes seen in several of the diversion and homicide-related cases in this documentary, a difference that often reflects the more direct, testimony-based nature of the evidence in an abuse case compared to the forensic and financial record analysis required in drug diversion or suspicious death investigations. The jury convicted Rowe of second-degree elder abuse, classified under Missouri law as a Class B felony. Following the verdict, the court ordered a sentencing assessment report, a standard pre-sentencing process in which a probation officer or corrections official compiles background information on the defendant, including criminal history, personal circumstances, and any relevant psychological evaluation to assist the judge in determining an appropriate sentence within the statutory range for the offense. The exact sentence ultimately imposed, along with the specific year of the trial, are not fully documented in the publicly available reporting reviewed for this case. As with cases 6 and 7, we note this gap directly, rather than presenting an assumed outcome. Anyone seeking the confirmed sentence and case year should consult Jasper County's public court record system. This case is included in this documentary because it represents a category of nurse-related offense distinct from hospital diversion and distinct from the suspected homicide cases covered earlier. Abuse occurring within a long-term residential care setting, prosecuted under Missouri's specific elder abuse statute, and proven through direct testimony rather than forensic or digital evidence. That is Case 8. Case 9, James Todd. This case is the most recent in this documentary, and it remains, at the time of this recording, an open criminal matter. No conviction has occurred, and the defendant has denied the allegations against him. We present it here in the interest of documenting a fully verified set of charges, while being explicit that a charge is not a finding of fact. James H. Todd, a resident of Ripley, Tennessee, worked as a contract, or traveling, nurse assigned to the emergency department at Phelps Health in Rolla, Missouri. Traveling nurses are healthcare professionals who take short-term assignments at hospitals experiencing staffing shortages, often moving between states and facilities on contracts lasting weeks or months, and their employment arrangements mean their professional history is sometimes harder for a single facility to fully vet compared to a permanently employed staff member. According to charging documents, on June 4, 2026, Todd is accused of sexually assaulting a female patient who had been admitted to the emergency department for treatment of low potassium levels, after he had placed her intravenous line. He was arrested the following day, June 5, 2026. The charges filed against Todd include multiple felony counts, first-degree sodomy, first-degree rape or attempted rape, and first-degree sexual abuse. Given the severity of these charges, Todd was held without the possibility of bond at the Phelps County Jail following his arrest. The investigative process in this case began with the patient's report to the Rolla Police Department. In cases involving alleged sexual assault within a healthcare setting, standard investigative procedure includes a forensic medical examination of the patient, an evidence collection process typically conducted by a trained sexual assault nurse examiner, interviews with hospital staff who were present or nearby during the relevant time window, and a review of the hospital's security camera footage covering the area and time period in question. In this case, reporting indicates that hospital security footage was reviewed and reportedly appeared to show contact consistent with the patient's account, though the ultimate evidentiary weight of that footage will be determined through the court process, not through news reporting. Todd has denied the allegations against him. As of this recording, in mid-2026, the case remains pending. No trial date, plea agreement, or verdict has been reported. We want to be direct about why this case is included and how it should be understood by anyone watching. Under the American legal system, a criminal charge is a formal accusation that a prosecutor has determined is supported by sufficient evidence to bring before a court. It reflects probable cause, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Every defendant, including Todd, is presumed innocent unless and until a court determines otherwise, whether through a guilty plea or a trial verdict. A documentary that treats a pending charge as equivalent to a conviction misrepresents the legal status of the case and the rights of the person involved. This case also illustrates a structural issue specific to traveling and contract healthcare staffing. Because these professionals move frequently between facilities and states, the standard mechanisms hospitals use to vet permanent staff, including multi-year employment verification and cross-referencing with state licensing boards in every jurisdiction a nurse has worked, can be more difficult to apply comprehensively in the limited time frame before a contract assignment begins. We will note, for anyone following this case after this recording, that its final outcome should be verified through Phelps County court records or credible local reporting before being treated as settled fact. That is Case 9. Case 10, Brook Holler. This final case concludes our documentary, and it comes with an important geographic caveat that we want to state plainly before going further. This case has only a partial connection to Missouri. Brooke Haller was employed as a registered nurse at a hospital located in Kansas City, Kansas, not Missouri, and her case was prosecuted in the District of Kansas. Her conduct, however, extended into Missouri through the pharmacies where forged prescriptions were filled, which is why we include her here, with full transparency about the jurisdictional nuance. According to federal court records, beginning in March of 2024, Haller stole a nurse practitioner's prescription pad along with that practitioner's Drug Enforcement Administration registration number, the unique identifier that allows a licensed prescriber to authorize controlled substances. Using these stolen credentials, Haller forged 13 separate prescriptions for Percocet and oxycodone, writing them in the names of her relatives rather than in her own name, a method that allowed her to distance the fraudulent prescriptions from her own identity when they were presented at pharmacy counters. The prescriptions were filled at pharmacies in both Kansas and Missouri. Records indicate that one Missouri pharmacy alone dispensed 1,350 tablets of oxycodone through this scheme, while Kansas pharmacies dispensed an additional 90 tablets of Percocet and 540 tablets of oxycodone. As the scheme continued, Haller took additional steps to avoid detection. When pharmacy staff began raising questions, she reportedly impersonated a pharmacy employee and used technology to make her phone number appear as though it belonged to a different, verified line, a method sometimes called number spoofing. At one point, when the scheme began to unravel in October of 2024, she posed as a man using the name Peter in a phone conversation with pharmacy staff. However, staff who had interacted with Haller previously in her professional capacity recognized her voice during that call, which became a key point of exposure in the case. The investigation was ultimately triggered by a routine pharmacy verification call, a standard practice in which pharmacy staff contact a prescriber's office directly to confirm that a prescription is legitimate before dispensing a controlled substance, particularly for high-risk medications like Percocet and oxycodone. When pharmacy staff placed this verification call to the hospital associated with the prescription pad, the fraudulent nature of the scheme was exposed. The Drug Enforcement Administration's St. Louis Field Division then conducted the broader investigation. Haller pleaded guilty to one count of possession of a controlled substance obtained by deception and subterfuge. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation and a fine of $5,000. Beyond the criminal sentence, Haller lost her nursing license as a result of the case and received a lifetime ban from working at any hospital that receives federal funding, a consequence separate from and in addition to her criminal sentence, reflecting the licensing and administrative penalties that can follow healthcare-related fraud convictions independent of the court's sentencing decision. This case illustrates the role that routine verification procedures play in catching prescription fraud before it can escalate further. The pharmacy verification call that exposed this scheme is not an extraordinary security measure. It is a standard, everyday safeguard built into pharmacy practice specifically because prescription pads and prescriber credentials are known points of vulnerability for exactly this type of fraud. It also illustrates why jurisdictional accuracy matters in a documentary like this one. Haller's employment, her hospital, and her federal prosecution were all based in Kansas. Her connection to Missouri exists specifically through the pharmacies where the forged prescriptions were filled. A responsible account of this case must make that distinction clear rather than presenting her, without qualification, as a Missouri case in the same category as Jennifer Hall or Lindsay Francis. That is case 10, and that concludes this documentary. 10 cases. 4 resulted in confirmed convictions with fully documented sentences. 2 remain open questions in the public record, their final outcomes unconfirmed despite formal federal indictment. 1 ended in complete dismissal after the forensic science underlying it failed to hold up under independent scrutiny. 1 remains an active, pending criminal matter with no conviction, and 2 carry jurisdictional caveats worth understanding before drawing conclusions from them. That range of outcomes is not a flaw in this documentary. It is the accurate picture of how the justice system actually functions. Unevenly, over years, sometimes decades, through forensic science that improves and sometimes fails, through federal and state processes that don't always move at the same pace or produce headlines when they conclude quietly. If you found value in a documentary that tells you not just what happened, but what is and isn't confirmed, subscribe to Hidden Case Diaries for more investigations built the same way. Like this video, drop a comment with the case that stayed with you, and we'll see you in the next one.